The story of Purim is the one book of the Bible we read in the dark, and its content seems to be filled with darkness. Everyone seems to be other than who they are, a king who is no king, a prime minister who is the ancient descendants of Amalek, this nation that is vowed to destroy Israel. Israel's opposite number. Every light casts a shadow, where Israel and the Jewish people are exemplify compassion and kindness and justice. Amalek exemplifies selfishness and struggle for ascendancy and power, where Israel represents a spiritual, Amalek is sunk in the physical, where Israel represents peace, Amalek represents violence. Amalek, our opposite number. So Haman comes from this ancient nation, and Mordechai and Esther, it seems, comes from the royal house of Saul, of Benjamin. Benjamin was the one child of Jacob who did not bow before Esau during the confrontation between Jacob and Esau, where the brothers are finally reconciled. All of the tribes prostrate themselves, humble themselves before Esau, who was the source of Amalek, the source of the opposite number of the Jewish people, except for Benjamin. And so from this tribe of Benjamin comes the royal house of Saul that was supposed to end the threat of Amalek forever. Unfortunately, Saul spectacularly fails, and the final dispensation, the final repair against Amalek is left to his descendants, to Mordechai and to Esther. But we get ahead of ourselves. There's one more question we have to ask, or one more observation we have to make in this remarkable story of everything, things that are not as they seem. At the end of the book, at the very end of the book, it says, Vayamim ha'ela, chapter 9, Nizkarim v'na'asim b'chol dor v'dor, mishpacha mishpacha, medina medina, v'ir v'ir, v'mei Purim ha'ela lo ya'avuru. The days of Purim, the holiday of Purim, will never pass away, mitoch ha'Yehudim, from the Jews. V'zichram lo yasuf mizaram. And the memory, the celebration of Purim will never cease. All the other, it says when the Messiah comes, all the other holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, all of those holidays will pass away when Mashiach comes. But Purim will remain. Why? Why? What is behind this? The very name Megillah, Megillat Esther, the Arizal, the Isaac Luria, the arch Kabbalist, teaches us that Megillah, Megaleh, and Megillah scroll mean reveal. Esther, the name Esther, her name means hidden. The hidden will be revealed. What is the hidden? Let's look at some answers. Strangely enough, if we look in the book of Ezra, now the Jewish people were exiled from their land. We betrayed the covenants. We abandoned the Torah. We abandoned the ways of compassion and justice and went after false gods and false ideals, violence, disrespecting the covenant, disrespecting the obligation, moral obligation of each of us to each other. And as a result, we were exiled. At the very end, 70 years, says Jeremiah, after that exile, we became worthy of returning to our land, to the land of Israel. And indeed, the Persian emperor, Cyrus the Great, conqueror of Babylonia. And by the way, according to our tradition, none other than Vashti. Vashti was the true heir of Babylonia. Does that make sense? Queen Vashti, the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the destroyer of the temple. Achashverosh, a usurper, not a king. Doesn't say he's a king, a usurper. The Midrash says that he came into the palace as a stable hand, and through his good looks, his charm, charisma, and his utter ruthlessness and lack of any scruple about betrayal, violence, murder, he rose in the palace hierarchy to the kingship. And trying to legitimize his kingship, he took to forcibly to marry the one legitimate royalty of the Babylonian and Persian Empire in the story, Vashti. But as soon as she has helped him establish himself, he throws a gigantic party. He doesn't need her anymore. He gets rid of her. And that explains all the story of chapter 1. The usurper rising to power, tried to besot his kingdom with the tax breaks and gifts and all sorts of ways to bribe and to inveigle his way into the loyalty of his nation. But it fails. It fails because there is a plot to assassinate him. And who reveals the plot? All these nobodies. He brings in people who are not threats to him. He brings in Haman, who is from another country entirely, an immigrant, so to speak. He brings in this person, Esther, who is only from Shushan. I'm Esther from Shushan, a person without a past. He brings in people who will not be threats to him. He brings in people who will not threaten his legitimacy because he is not the legitimate ruler. And so we see all of these things, these palace intrigues, kind of making sense in a strange way in this chaos that is the Megillah. And maybe even in this chaos that is all of life, this kind of shadow show of life after the destruction of the temple. So Cyrus the Great allows the Jews to return. And then we come to a turning point. We see something that explains the entire book of Esther. I'm going to share the screen. We're going to go to the book of Ezra, chapter 2. So let's get ready. So these are the people of the province. Ve'ele b'nei hamedina ha'olim mishevi hagolah asher heglen Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel leBavel ve'yashuvu liYerushalayim veYehuda ish le'iro. These are the people that when Cyrus allowed the Jews to return, that started to return to the land of Israel. It started to go home again, 70 years after the destruction. And then here are the names. Asher ba'u im Zerubbabel. These are the ones who came with the first Jewish governor who was appointed by Cyrus to rule over the Jews returning to Judea. The names were Yeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Re'ela, and now listen carefully, Mordechai, Bilshan. Mordechai, the interpreter. Bilshan, coming from Bal Lashon, or perhaps diplomat. Mordechai. But we thought he was back in Shushan. But here he is, returning to Jerusalem. Years before, there was a Haman. Years before, there was a King Achashverosh. Years before, there was an Esther. Mordechai, a young diplomat, returns to his homeland. But things are not smooth. Things do not go well. Let's read on ahead a little bit. And we discover that when the opponents of Israel, when the enemies of the Jewish people, let's move ahead. When the opponents of the Jewish people discover what is going on, that the Jews have returned to their land. Here we are. V'yishmut sarai Yehuda u'Binyamin, ki bnei hagolah bonim eichal Adonai Elohei Yisrael. When they were rebuilding the temple, they approached Zerubbabel and they said, let us build with you. We worship your God too. We offer sacrifices to God since we were exiled here. So who were these people? They're known as the Samaritans, but these are people who were brought in when the Jews were driven out, and now they are not happy to see the Jews coming home again. And they try to join up and to try to subvert the Jewish project, shall we call it the Zionist project. They try to subvert it, but when that fails, they say it is not for you, but it is us to build. This is for us. This is our home, and we want to come back to our home. Thereupon, the people undermined the resolve of the people and made them afraid to build through acts of attack and violence. They bribed ministers to thwart their plans all the years of King Cyrus of Persia. And in the reign of Achashverosh, they drew up an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So all of a sudden, this starts to look familiar. We say Achashverosh, we see the work of the temple was stopped. The work of the rebuilding of Zion was stopped. We see the enemies of the Jewish people hire and employ lobbyists and officers to try to stop the rebuilding project. And of course, the Jews of Jerusalem and the Jews of Babylonia, the Jews of Persia, try to oppose this. And this explains why Mordecai returns to Persia. He's trying to fix the situation, trying to assure the Persians and to allow the temple to be rebuilt. And Haman, rather than just a random courtier, is actually the opposite number of Mordecai, hired by the enemies of the Jewish people to undermine, to spread accusations, and to try to destroy the Jews. So suddenly we see the reason why these two, who are known to each other from back in Israel, after all, Haman, the descendant of Amalek, and Mordecai, the descendant of the royal house, they know each other. And this is why when they can find each other again years later in Shushan, the conflict continues. Haman's plans are to destroy Israel, and he is fabulously successful. He goes to the usurper Achashverosh, offering bribes, offering recognition. He obtains permission to destroy all the Jews. And Mordecai is devastated. It seems like the whole project is coming to an end. But something unbelievable happens. That unbelievable thing is Esther Hamalka, Queen Esther, a wild card, someone that nobody could have predicted, nobody could have seen. Suddenly, it says that when she stood before King Achashverosh, that she was up all night praying to God. She comes to King Achashverosh, she feels God's presence, and she says a psalm as the morning star shows up, Ayelet HaShachar. And that psalm is preserved. Ayelet HaShachar, the rising star of the Jewish people coming back again to their land. This young woman rising up completely out of nowhere, completely unpredictable, takes Jewish history in her hands and turns it all around. Esther, the hidden. So that is why this story is so important. It's to remind us, as we are in another exile today, we are in a second exile, a much longer exile. And yet, even from within the darkness of that exile, the first exile and our exile, there is Ayelet HaShachar, there is a hidden star, there is an Esther rising up, even if we can't see it ourselves. Let's take a look at that strange statement of the Megillah that Purim will be the only holiday, the last holiday. Why is that? We can compare the holidays to bonfires in the darkness. Here in the exile, these bonfires light our way one more step forward, one more step on the Jewish journey in the world. We make our way to Rosh Hashanah, and then that lights our way to the next bonfire, to Yom Kippur, which lights our way to Sukkot, which lights our way to Hanukkah, and so on and so forth. But when Mashiach comes, when the time of redemption arrives, there's no more need for bonfires because it's like the night is over. The dawn rises. And when the day is bright, we don't need bonfires. The world is transformed. Only one holiday, a holiday that's not a bonfire, but a holiday that sees even within the darkness, light from within the very darkness, making us realize that we might feel abandoned, we might feel alone, we might feel lost, we might feel there's no hope. There always is. There is Esther, that hidden star of the dawn. And that's why we read the Megillah at night. We read the Megillah at night to remind us that this world we live in, especially this last year, seems like a world encased in impenetrable darkness that can never truly be made light again and fixed again. And yet we are told as Jews that from within that darkness, from within the night, we read the scroll of hiddenness, Megillat Esther, the scroll of the dark, and we realize that even the darkness is just an illusion to the eternal light that is within the heart, that is within everywhere, that is within hope. So let's read the Megillah. Let's look for its hidden meanings. That Hashem is standing, is right there with us right now. That love and compassion and hope are right there, right now. And that if we can just see through the curtain of darkness, we can finally see the world as it is and see the light that is already starting to rise. Chag Sameach.